Welcome to Chapter 2. You've made it through Chapter 1. Test is done. We're moving on. We're going to talk about some new things. In the discussion of logic, we have to understand the words carry meanings and definitions, and that those words and definitions within logic sometimes aren't the same as they are in our culture. Words tend to change in our culture. We want to look at how we look at words and then how that they function. And so as a result of that, we have to keep in mind that words change. When I was in high school, the word sick meant that you had a fever and that you were coughing and that your nose was plugged up and you had a stomach ache, you ached all over. In culture today, students say, oh, that's sick, and it doesn't mean anything to do with the temperature of my body, but has everything to do with how I'm perceiving something, not in a negative way, but in a positive way. Back in the 70s, the early 70s, when I was in high school, and this is not to be offensive to anyone, but merely to show you how things change over time, the word fag meant a cigarette. In the late 80s, 90s, early 2000s, the word fag became to mean something completely different. To be very honest with you, the word has changed. I'm not sure exactly what that word means in the context of today's culture. So taking the word in the context of when it's used is very, very important, or the context in which it's used is very, very important. And in logic, we have to make sure that we keep those meanings within the context of logic. So sometimes the word we use in logic may mean something a bit different in our normal everyday culture, but that doesn't mean that it means the exact same thing in the class. So keeping that in mind, we want to make sure our definitions and our terminology is on the same wavelength. Okay, so what we want to do is we want to look at words and their functions. Okay, and so we're going to do that, sections 2.1 and 2.2. We argue with someone. Sometimes we say the same thing, but we say it differently. So there's different types of arguments, different types of disagreements, and we want to look at those. The first one would be a verbal disagreement. And that's a disagreement related to the use of a different meaning for the same term. If I say unbiased news, you could argue with me all day long that Fox News is the most unbiased news channel on television today. Okay, your neighbor could argue with me that CNN is the most unbiased. And what it comes down to is how are you looking at the word unbiased? If I'm looking at it from Fox News perspective as opposed to CNN's perspective, I would say that the person who says that Fox News is an unbiased news station or news network would probably be from the conservative right-wing part of our country. The person who says that CNN is the most unbiased would probably be a little more liberal and a little bit more left-wing. One being Republican, the other being Democrat, one possibly being more religious than the other. Multiple variables come into play. And so verbal disagreements sometimes disagree over the same, using the exact same term. The other disagreement is a factual disagreement. Okay, and that's just dictating as a fact of whether a proposition is true or false. Peyton Manning is a great quarterback. That depends on who you talk to. I know people who think that he's a superior quarterback, but I've met people, even in Denver, who don't necessarily think he's the greatest quarterback. So once again, keeping in mind these types of concepts, let's look at the rest of this chapter and maybe it'll become a little bit clearer. Okay, there's two types of meanings found on page 79 in your textbook. Cognitive meaning and an emotive meaning. Cognitive meaning conveys information. Let's see, if I were to convey information, I'm trying to think of something off the top of my head, but one of the things I could say that in his book, Unchristian, Dave Kenneman and Gabe Lyons did research of 30,000 people, and they found that most millennials, which are people between the ages of, say, 20 and 35, most millennials in America, and this was in, I think, 2009, most millennials in America felt that cohabitation was not immoral. They felt that it was morally okay. That is cognitive information. Why? We have the research of 30,000 people, both evangelical Christian and non-Christian, in that 30,000, equally distributed from all parts of the country, urban to rural. Okay, north to south, east to west, Midwest, right? And so we see that, we say, oh, it's cognitive. Emotive feeling is something that's more based on, or is based on the concept of my emotion. Should abortion be legal? Well, it depends on how I look at abortion and the emotional impact that abortion's had on my life. Should same-sex marriage be legal, or civil unions be legal in our country today? Once again, a very emotional subject. So once again, the meaning possibly could be evoked. My feelings are evoking the meaning that I bring to that discussion or that dialogue. Okay, now as we go, this is now in section 2.2. As we go further into the concept, we want to talk about two sets of words: intention or connotation, and extension or denotation. If you have your textbook in front of you, which I recommend you do because I'm going to be referring to it as we go through, especially the rest of this class. On page 90, there's a box up at the top of the page. And it kind of gives an example, a visual of this slide. So I want you to keep that in mind. So it's slide number 4, but keep that in mind, a visual of what it means. So if I say the word inventor, looking at page 90, okay, extension would be members of the class. Intentions would be attributes of that specific thing. So if I look at the word inventor, the extension or the denotation of that would be an inventor would be Thomas Edison or Alexander Graham Bell or the Wright brothers, right? Somebody who created or invented something, okay? Henry Ford or whoever, however we want to look at that. If I look at attributes of an inventor, I'm going to say it's somebody who's creative and intuitive and imaginative. And so once again, extension, okay, goes bigger. Intention goes smaller. So extension creates a larger class. Intention narrows down the class, right? So keep these in mind because it's going to come in very handy as you go into your homework assignments for section 2.1 and 2.2. Oops. Now, one of these days I'll figure out technology, and that will help a lot. How about that? There we go. So if we have the example of a dog, we use the inventor on page 90. Let's look at the idea of a dog. Intention, okay? Intention goes smaller. It becomes more specific. If I say a dog is a mammal. It's a canine. It's warm-blooded, right? So what am I doing? I'm giving very specifics about the dog. But if I do extension or denotation, what I'm doing is I'm saying, give me a dog. So a dog could be a poodle, a Dalmatian, a pit bull, right? A German Shepherd. Or it could be Lassie or Odie. So Lassie being a TV dog, Odie being a cartoon dog. It could be Foxy and Charlie. Those are my two dogs, right? So once again, we look at the idea, one bringing a broader picture, the other one bringing a narrow. So remember that intention is narrowing it down to specifics, and it connotes something, and extension broadens the ideology or the class membership, and it denotes something. Okay, I'll figure out all of this technology in a minute. All right, conventional connotation, the attributes. A term commonly calls forth in the minds of competent speakers of the language. Okay, so this would be a word. Let me think of the word convention. In the United States, we have a tendency to throw out the word freedom. And we say, now, what does freedom mean? And if I were in class, I'd ask you, what does freedom mean? And you could give me all the answers that you think of what freedom is, right? Now, let's take it to the convention of Iran. Or let's take it to the convention of some other dictatorial country, and let's talk about the word freedom. Do they have freedoms in Iran? Absolutely. Does Iran have the freedom of America? It depends. How are we defining freedom? What's the convention in which that word's being used? Very, very important that we look at these kinds of things. So as we talk about logic, we want to kind of keep these kinds of things in mind. Okay? The other thing that we deal with in this chapter is the idea of an empty extension. It's a term that represents a class with no membership. So an empty extension would be, say, if I were to say a living dinosaur. Are there any? Now I suppose we could say some types of reptiles or etc. are living dinosaurs. But in the reality of what is a dinosaur, the concept of a living dinosaur has no extension. I can't go any further than that, right? Another example, just to be humorous, would be an entertaining logics text. The only way this text becomes entertaining is if you add cartoons to it. Or you watch the idiot on the screen telling you what it means, right? So all of these have intention, okay? We have the detail of it, but we can't go out. We can't broaden the perspective. Give me the name of a living dinosaur. There aren't any. Give me the name of a entertaining logic book. Not going to be out there. Maybe Logic for Dummies might be entertaining if there is one, but you get the concept. And then we have increasing and decreasing intention. Intention is increasing as modifiers are added to the definition. Conversely, it decreases as modifiers are taken away. So, for example, going from dog, a domesticated canine, to Dalmatian, a domesticated canine of a given variety, increases intention. Okay, and so if we go back to our diagram on page, or our chart on page 90, right? What are we doing? We're becoming narrow. We're narrowing down dog. Now we've narrowed it down to a specific kind of dog. So we've decreased. I always get this backwards. We've decreased or increased the intention, right? We've increased the intention because we're going more specific. Extension is increased when you go from one group to a numerically larger group. Okay. So conversely, it's decreased when you go from one group to a numerically smaller subgroup. For example, going from dog to Dalmatian decreases extension because there are fewer Dalmatians than there are dogs. Okay, so just think through the concept. Think it through, look at it over, and you'll get the concept. So some general observations as we close out this video. There is usually an inverse relation between intention and extension. For example, going from U.S. presidents to Republican U.S. presidents increases my intention. I've narrowed it down, okay? And it decreases the extension because I've narrowed it down, right? I've made it more specific. It's not always the case. Going from U.S. presidents to male U.S. presidents increases the intention, but it doesn't affect the extension. And the reason for that, why? Because it's still the same number of people. But I've narrowed down the group. I've taken away just U.S. president, and I've identified a group of now U.S. presidents that are male. Okay, that increases the intention even though it doesn't change the number. That's why it doesn't affect extension. Okay, so keep that in mind. Do the homework assignments, write down your questions, bring them to class. I look forward to seeing you then.